Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 379, and this is March the 9th, 1979. I want to share with you on this tape the information I have from a book that I waited a long time to receive. I first learned about it in 1978 and discussed on tape number 346. That was in August of 78. The book is called Treason for My Daily Bread. There was one review of the book in The Guardian, and I never heard anything more about it. It was put out by Valency Press in London, and it was reviewed in June of 77. And this book has made the allegations that the Nazis, specifically Martin Bormann of the Bormann Brotherhood, are behind or were behind the killing of John Kennedy and would be behind the killing of other leaders in this country and around the world. And I wanted the information from that book because of the extensive work I'd done on the Kennedy assassination and the Nazi connections. A friend of mine went to London over the Christmas holidays, and I promised on an earlier tape we'd get to it, but we were busy with the subjects of Jonestown and John Paisley's death and the Rockefeller death, and now I want to get to this book because I think it's important, and it may be a piece of the puzzle that we've been looking for a long time. I completed it and took a lot of notes, and I'll share some of those with you. Whenever I read a book on the John Kennedy assassination, I read it with two eyes, usually. One is critical, to see what is being covered up. Is there disinformation? Are there outright lies? Can you make allowance for ignorance, innocent ignorance, where the author just didn't investigate far enough, but what he did was a good job? And the second thing I look for, of course, is new information. And out of every book, you can pick up some pieces of new information, even if they're trying to divert you from the larger facts. But I look at each book that I have very, very critically, and I have over almost 200 books now critical of the Warren Commission work. I think every book that has been published that I've known about on the John Kennedy assassination, and I take each new book, and the guidelines that I use specifically have to do with the past pieces that were published, articles and books, unpublished manuscripts, and also my extensive 8 years of cross-filing the Warren Commission hearings, the testimony and the evidence that came before the Warren Commission that's in the 26 volumes. I have to admit that I was prejudiced when I began reading this book. I think we come to each book either knowing you're going to hate it or like it, with a certain knowledge of what it's about. And there were so many links of the Nazis to the John Kennedy assassination that I was very anxious to get this book, and so I was looking in some ways. I try to be objective, but with keeping my mind open, seeing what more information Mr. Lebedev has on the assassination of John Kennedy that links to the Nazis. A few of the links to the Nazis that I just briefly will run off the names for you. They may not mean to you very much when I run them off, but they were important links of Lee Harvey Oswald and the Warren Commission to Adolf Hitler's Nazis. I'm not talking about the Nazi Party in America or that loose-knit group that surfaces with the armbands. I'm talking about the Adolf Hitler organization. And one was Albert Osborne, the man that was on the bus with Oswald going to Mexico, who ran a school for assassins, who could possibly have trained this assassin that Mr. Mikhail Lebedev is writing about. George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's buddy, who was a Nazi spy, apprehended during World War II as a Nazi spy, and the cousin of Baron Rangel, who worked with Hitler's agents. He was part of that Polish Eastern European army group funded by Herbert Hoover that created Adolf Hitler, actually formed Adolf Hitler to fight against the Soviet Union. Ruth Payne and Michael Payne had home base for Lee and Marina Oswald in Irving, Texas, which is next to Dallas and Fort Worth, and Michael Payne worked for Walter Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal who came over with Werner von Braun, who has close links to the Bormann Brotherhood, and he was director of Bell Aerospace. Of course, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, whose Division 5 was involved in the Kennedy assassination, with Permindex, a spy organization, had strong links to Meyer Heydrich and Nazis up to and during World War II. He broke off just before Pearl Harbor, was closely associated with the Nazis just until we were bombed by the Japanese army. Otto Winneker from Germany was a historian from the Pentagon who sent men over to write the Warren Report. I don't know that he specifically was pro-Nazi, but they had a German historian writing the Warren Report. Clay Shaw, a very important link of the assassination in New Orleans with David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald, and a member of Hermandex that funded the assassination teams, had met with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and Allen Dulles, and Hermandex was a nest of Nazis and members of the Bormann Brotherhood. Clay Shaw's name comes up in the assassination. Jean de Mohrenschildt, the wife of George de Mohrenschildt, her father was the director of Far Eastern Railroad, and there's a book out. I have a reference here for you, The Russian Fascists, that I've done a tape on, and they had strong links from Harbin to Shanghai to use aircraft and Lockheed, and Jean de Mohrenschildt was friend and hostess to Marina Oswald and Lee Oswald, and they took them for medical care and bought things for the baby and gifts, and introduced them to the white Russian community that Lebedev writes about in his book. The Lawrence Orloff that he writes about, the Colonel Orloff, the Nazi that he meets in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and also he's a friend of David Ferry's in New Orleans, went to Marina Oswald's home and introduced himself. They both went to see her when Lee was working, and began the connections of Marina Oswald with the Dallas-Fort Worth members of the intelligence community, the oil community, and Orloff is mentioned in this book. There are many people mentioned. I've given you a list on the sheet that comes with the tape that are mentioned in the book, and as far as I'm concerned, the ones that he mentioned do check out to my research, whether or not we can ever locate Zed, and we'll talk about that, who Lebedev claims did the fatal headshot to John Kennedy from behind the fence at the grassy knoll. That remains to be seen. I doubt if Zed is alive, but it's an interesting tale, and you have to take the book for what Lebedev is saying he did and how he did it, and how this network of the Bormann Brotherhood is centralized and working, and how it played an important role in our politics in 1963. This story begins in March 1905, that's 74 years ago, just 74 years ago in March, when Mikhail Lebedev was born in Russia. The story was written in March 15, 1966, 13 years ago. The manuscript was turned over and completed and given to a publisher from London in Beirut. Lebedev gave it to him at that time, and then it was published 11 years later in March of 1977. The London publisher was vacationing in Beirut. He was sitting by a swimming pool, and a man came up to him and said, "You're a publisher, and my name is Lebedev, and I have a story to tell you, a manuscript." And he put it on him, and it took several years to read it, edit it, and evidently he believed in it, and no American publisher would touch it. And finally, a little-known British publisher accepted it by the name of Valency Press. It was edited by W.G. Stanton, and the book, Treason for My Daily Bread, went from a diary and a manuscript then into book form. I think I'll begin discussing the book by just reading you a page at the conclusion. Before I go more into the book, there's several pages that I think that are important, and I always like to start at the end and see how it ends, and then go back and see how it unravels. And I want to read with you because I can't translate it any better than what Mikhail Lebedev is saying. And this is the man who worked for Martin Bormann and was sent to New Orleans and then to Shreveport to meet Zed, the man who would do the fatal headshot at the fence that killed John Kennedy. He says, "The boy who was born in St. Petersburg on a March day in 1905 became the man who found himself in Dealey Plaza November day 1963 as part of a great machine designed for a single purpose. If my conscience is not over-troubled, it is because I have long come to accept that John Kennedy was not the only victim on that day. Zed and myself and other unknown members of that plot were victims, no less than he. It is no doubt true that I have refused to play my part and died for it, but it would have made no difference. There were more than enough of his fellow countrymen who wished John Kennedy ill and who readily have filled the space that I left. Not only tyrants suffer assassinations, and I am sure he knew his danger when Kennedy went to Dallas. It might be said with more than a little truth that he is the only man who comes out well of the whole miserable business. If anyone should search their own consciences, it is his own countrymen. I might interrupt here to say that I think he's absolutely right. The entire cabinet of Schlesinger, Salinger, his own brother Robert Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, the family, the wife, the press, the media, nobody comes out clean in this thing. They're all dirty, and they all covered it up. And he says that Kennedy may be the only man who comes out of the whole miserable business right, and you should search your own consciences and look at your own countrymen. If those who contrive to kill him are to be found, they must not be looked for in the sleazier parts of New Orleans, or Miami, or Chicago, for these men were only the instruments of the assassination. I may interrupt again here to say Chicago, because Zed had, infers, had part of the assignment of killing John Kennedy in Chicago also, and left the Windy City, and sorry that he didn't stay up there. There were plans to kill John Kennedy November the 1st, 1963, but it was called off because of the murder of DM in Southeast Asia. Kennedy didn't come to Chicago at the time. But Lebedev seems to know about Chicago, and he says, don't look in the sleazy parts of New Orleans or Miami or Chicago, because these men were only the instruments of the assassination. The men who wielded those instruments must be sought in the seats of big business, of influence, of economic and political power, the men who never paid taxes to the country which gave them their wealth. They were the men whom Kennedy threatened, and they were the men who struck him down for his presumption. Now, the group that never paid taxes, that gets a tax write-off on the oil to depletion allowance, that pump oil in Venezuela and Middle East and so forth, and invest their profits overseas so they won't have to pay taxes here, are companies like the Exxon, Standard Oil, Mobil Oil. There was the Humble Oil in Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Getty people, the Onassis oil involvement in this assassination, the Howard Hughes involvement in the assassination, the Hughes oil bit, the bit that helped dig oil for all these oil men, and H.L. Hunt, the oil combines, and Mr. Richardson and the John Conley connections in Dallas-Fort Worth, and Mr. Murchison, Gulf Oil, as I say, Mobil Oil. All the oil companies had a piece of the action in the Kennedy assassination, and he seems to be saying this because he's talking about those people that got wealth and were threatened because Kennedy seemed to want to be taxing their money. This is what he's implying, that they made profits over material. They never paid taxes to the country for their wealth. Lebedev says the assassination was a crime, but not the greatest crime. There's a greater, and that is that the men who committed it still walk the world. They still pick off instruments one by one to destroy them, still pull the strings which work the puppet politicians. They still amass the wealth which represents the blood and sweat of their fellow countrymen and half a world besides. They will never be brought to justice so long as those whom they exploit worship the same idols and continue to be seduced by the false doctrine that has replaced life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with wealth, status, and the pursuit of power. Now that translated means as long as you worship money, as long as you worship rich people and you're afraid to touch them, as long as you worship the security that you have by just idolizing these people and trying to emulate them, then the assassins will be walking around the world and exploiting them because you have made them your idols instead of examining them. And that's what gives them the power to exploit and to be the assassins. I wrote something similar to that in 1972 in my first published article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? The section, American Assassins Are Mutations. And I said that when the TV cameras turn their lenses away from the crowd or the hired man who is photographed holding the weapon and the wide view screen, and they turn away, they will see the chambers of Washington, New York, and Montreal, where the real American assassins shall be properly identified. And I wrote at the time that the assassins were agents of the Galen organization, financed by the CIA through Allen Dulles, that involved Eastern European, Russians, and Germans, a spy organization that incorporated the Nazis, Adolf Hitler's teams, and that this was a network for the assassination teams, and they were found in the boardrooms in Washington, New York, and Montreal. I'm going to continue with the conclusion of his book, and then we'll go to the middle part, the beginning, middle, and the way the book structures it itself. In the end, he says, this manuscript was completed the 15th day of March, 1966, 2 weeks after my 61st birthday in the town of Beirut. My memory is a book that few would like to open and read, or else they would close it forever. If the story ever sees the light of day, if it could point the finger without fear of contradiction at the men behind the assassination of John Kennedy, then indeed my days would be quickly numbered. And for that reason I find it hard to explain why I have gone to the trouble of telling the story at all. But I grow more conscious with every day that my death really is an end, and that the story dies with me. That man is not important, but the story deserves to be told. I want to be able to say that I know who were the men of that great conspiracy, but I don't think that now they ever will be named. I believe they are men who are well known in high places in that turbulent country. But their treason succeeded, and when that happens, there are few who will dare name the traitors. What I do know is, I'm told by many Americans, is that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the man behind the gun that blew off the skull of John Kennedy. I cannot prove it, but I believe the finger on the trigger was Zed's. He was standing with Zed, and Zed fired, and Zed was wearing a radio control, and he could hear other shots at the time he fired. But Zed did the shot from the fence, and he believes that that was the fatal headshot. This was in 1966, long before the second committee got going. He said, had Oswald survived and his murderer, Jack Ruby, there is a faint hope the truth could have emerged, but that hope is only faint. Those men who organized the plot have made it only too clear to anyone who thinks to speak that the wiser part was silence. Since my return from that country, I have read eagerly every word about the assassination on which I could lay hands. It seems the event was a predictable phenomenon in a land where crimes to be reprehensible only if it's petty and if it fails. I have no illusions about the communist philosophy. Incidentally, Mikhail Lebedev spent 15 years in a communist camp in Siberia. We'll go into that. He didn't have his documentation when he was sent into Russia, and he was kept in prison for 15 years. So he has a lot of experience with the courts in Russia, more than any of us would ever hope to have. And he says this, he said, I have no illusions about the communist philosophy, nor have I any about the philosophy of capitalism, which seems to me to reach its lunatic peak in the United States. Organized business in that country is not at all unlike organized crime in its doctrine and practice. The fact that the capitalist philosophy has taken overtones of sanctity, enshrined in phrases like private enterprise, ought not to blind uncommitted men to the truth that there is no enterprise quite so private as crime, and that the killing of John Kennedy was merely private enterprise on a grand scale. The saddening truth for America is that the men who contrived to murder their president, his own countrymen, managed to conceal their identity. I believe they were known to one man, and that he, from wrong-headed motives, decided that the truth had best not be known. So he hid the truth, which he should have revealed, and will no doubt go to his grave with his lips sealed. Now, I don't know whether he's referring to J. Edgar Hoover, who he talks about later in future sentences, or whether he means Allen Dulles. He goes on, no impartial man, even without the knowledge I possess, accepts the Warren Commission as the truth about the assassination, nor do I believe the American people pin their hopes on discovering the truth when the evidence which was hidden there is finally taken from the archives after a 50-year sleep. Actually, it was 75. The evidence which really matters, the questions which should have been asked, were not, will die with the men who should have given it, and the guiltiest men of all will soon, in the natural course of things, be beyond reach of question. I believe this one man knew of the conspiracy and had more than an idea who was behind it, but he had long shirked the task of confronting organized crime in his country. And that's J. Edgar Hoover, who worked with Interpol and Meyer Heydrich and the top Nazis, vice president of Interpol, the Nazi organization. He long shirked the task of confronting organized crime and was totally unprepared to deal with its logical outcome in the presidential assassination. Rather than face the real monster which the American system had spawned, he had busied himself tilting the windmills of communist organizations in his country. And when the monster struck in a quite predictable way, he looked for another windmill, with the conspirators supplying the shape of Lee Harvey Oswald as their patsy. They almost failed even then. They clearly intended that the body of Oswald should be delivered up riddled with police bullets, with all the needful evidence upon his person. But the police were ham-fisted. They fouled up the killing of Officer Tippit. They fouled up the comic Oswald arrest. They fouled up the switching of rifles in the book depository. Besides that, Oswald was a terrible shot. Indeed, so many grievous mistakes were made after the event that only the most rigorous whitewashing could prevent the truth from coming out, as it so nearly did. But they had considerable help in their effort to suppress the truth. They were assisted, for all the wrong reasons, by the man placed to suppress it, the man whose crusade against communism had left his country defenseless against a greater enemy within. That man, he says, was J. Edgar Hoover. There is no concrete proof of that accusation, and I suspect there may never be. This was in 1966 he wrote this, and I think there is concrete proof today of J. Edgar Hoover's role with the Warren Commission, but he didn't have that in 1966. He said no detached observer could study the actions of the FBI after the assassination without coming to the conclusion that their first efforts to discover the truth quickly changed to more desperate efforts to hide it. The Warren Commission was given an impossible task, the task of finding the truth while the vital evidence was concealed from them or distorted. You know how many times I've talked about the evidence being removed, the rifle that didn't have the handprints of Lee Harvey Oswald, the car that was sent to Michigan, the street sign at Dealey Plaza, the lamppost, the CIA papers of Oswald that were missing, the clothing of John Connolly that was dry cleaned, the autopsy x-rays of John Kennedy, the bullet proof that there might have been 2 different bullets fired at John Kennedy's head, the brains missing, about 35 pieces of hard evidence that the Warren Commission had concealed from them, but they didn't demand it. You see, they were in collusion, but he says they tried to do the impossible with all the vital evidence concealed from them. So at the end of the day, it was not the evidence which convinced them that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. It was J. Edgar Hoover, and also, I might, Earl Warren. He said the irony of the situation is that he still believes he chose the best course for his country. He is not the only crime committed. His is not the only crime committed in the name of patriotism. The assassination is not the first, nor will it be the last in America's history, and in the course of time it will shrink to its true historic stature. But for that country the implications are more vital than the central event. No impartial student of history can doubt that on the 22nd of November 1963, the rot set in for America. The men who engineered the event, with almost limitless sources of wealth to back them, and the power which gave them that wealth, have had the power enhanced by their success. The question for the unhappy land, no less than for my own, is whether people can find some way to take the power back from the hands of the men who possess it. The future of the world may depend upon the answer to that question. That was written by Mikhail Lebedev in 1966. In March of 66, he completed that manuscript. In 1968, at the time of the elections, of course, Robert Kennedy was killed. In 1969, Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered, and Ted Kennedy then couldn't run for the 72 elections. In 1972, we had the Wallace shooting, George Wallace shooting, then he couldn't run against Richard Nixon. And in November 1978, we had the Rockefeller death, and no more conflicts on the floor of the Republican Party in 1980 for that election. So much for that. This is the belief of Lebedev, and I believe that that is why he wrote the book and even risked his life in Beirut to have you know some of the story, as much as he knew of the story, working on a need-to-know basis. The book is written in, I would say, 10 parts, and as much as time allows on the rest of this side of the tape and the next side of the tape, I'll go into some of the details of how he got into the assassination and ended up in Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963. The first part of the book is the story of his early childhood in Russia. He had a Russian mother, a father who died, evidently a hero in the Soviet Revolution. His father died in 1905. There were strikes of Soviet workers against the Tsar, and 2 months before Mikhail Lebedev was born, his father died, but he was a patriot for the Soviets, and then his mother also died, and he was moved to Germany. The second part of the book is his life in Germany, where he was raised as a child and went to a private school, and a friend of his father's and a teacher by the name of Albrecht befriended him, and he gave him a letter which had to do with his father's revolutionary activity in the Soviet Union, so that in case he ever went back to Russia, he could use it to prove that he was the son of this man who was a hero in those strikes, evidently in 1905, and that this letter would serve him in case the Russian police ever got him, because his father was known in Minsk and where they lived before Lebedev had gone to Germany. When he was a young adult, he went back to the Soviet Union, his hometown, and wanted to live there where his mother and father had lived under the Soviet system, and he immediately was put into a spy school. They recognized he had some papers and a letter, and he was put into a spy school where he had intensive 5-year training in the German language and was going to be sent back to Germany as a spy for the Soviet Union. They already had a spy high up in Hitler's camp, many Russian spies, and they had one working with Martin Bormann, the man who was the genius behind Adolf Hitler, running Hitler really, and later he used to set up the Spider, the Odessa, the Bormann Brotherhood, get ready for the Fourth Reich. But Martin Bormann made important decisions on the invasions into Russia, and they needed a spy working high up in the German echelon, and he had lived in Germany as a child, and he had 4 more years of training, and they sent him behind the lines to Germany to work for Martin Bormann, the notorious man behind Adolf Hitler. And being an intelligent person and good skills, Mikhail Lebedev did make up and work his way into the Bormann Adolf Hitler machinery at the very highest level to check on the intelligence that their other agents were giving to see if it was accurate about German intentions to invade Russia. He was still with Martin Bormann the last days in April 1945 when the Russians were coming into Germany, and Martin Bormann was getting ready to flee, and he needed protection. And at that time, instead of Lebedev staying in and being acknowledged as a Russian spy, Bormann said to him at that point, "I know you're a Russian spy, and you have to come with me, or you're going to be killed." And it's a cloak and dagger story. It's really a sad story, if this is all true, and I have reason to believe it's true because the characters are consistent with the past research, and it's a sad story. And Martin Bormann says, "Okay, we're going to leave now. We're going to leave Germany, and I need you because the Russians are coming across the borders," and the Russians went all the way as far as East Berlin. They split up Berlin down the middle. And he said, "I need you by my side so that in case they come to us, you can protect them." And Bormann had another name and a new identity, and in case the Russians swept in, they would have the protection of Lebedev, having been a Russian, to cover Martin Bormann's escape. And he said, "Okay, you're going to come with me now. You can't go back to Russia. I need you, and we're going to leave." So they were given papers. This story of the moving to Germany was the second part of the book, and then moving to Russia, rather, was the second part of the book, and then moving to Germany with Bormann was the third big part of the book. And then the fourth is when the Russians come into Germany and the escape of Lebedev and Bormann and how they get down to South America, to Paraguay, and successfully escape. They're disguised as missionaries, and they wear the cloak of monks, and they're put in an Italian missionary, which confirms the stories of Farrago of the escape of Bormann getting out, and the Vatican writing his passports and his papers. Lebedev and Bormann had impeccable papers when it was time to leave, and by November 1945, they were ready to leave Italy. We'll do some more of that story on the other side of this tape now. Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. This is side 2 of tape number 379, March the 9th, 1979. Oh, I'll interrupt the Lebedev story, the book, for just 1 second to make a couple of announcements that may not get to you otherwise. Thanks to some New York listeners who subscribed to the tapes and who were followers on WBAI, I got a call from Lynn Samuels in New York City, and she's going to call me on March the 26th. That's 3 to 5 o'clock New York time, and we're going to do a show. That's quite a big victory to get back on WBAI New York. They carried my tapes for several years, and I used to do many, many long shows with Bob Fass. And then I believe a COINTEL snow job came upon us, and Mark Lane put pressure on the station, and the tapes were taken off the air, and there was this big battle on the air about Mae Brussell and her information. And the station had a lot of reverses, lost a lot of money, lost their lease on 62nd Street, and it's been 2 years, I believe, since I've done anything with BAI in New York. And Lynn Samuels called, and one of the subscribers to these tapes sent her $20 for the telephone call because the station doesn't have the money. But that is great because I get a lot of letters from New York City, and she will promote it and try to get the listeners that used to follow Dialogue Conspiracy. So call your friends, and in New York City, tape that broadcast and call in and ask questions, and let's get that New York audience back, and maybe we can start making that a weekly or monthly call, possibly back to WBAI. And also on KXRX in San Jose, I'll be back there March the 6th, the same day. This is 9 to 12 at night with Lynn Ryder, and I've enclosed the information for you on that. And call in if you have questions. Don't write to me and ask me if you're in the area of San Francisco or San Jose and you can get on the air. Call me. I believe this is the 5th in a series once a month with Lynn up in KXRX. That's 3 hours of radio time to answer your questions, anything you want to know, and to tell new people about the tapes. So be sure and call in. And starting in April, I'll be back at KPFA once a month with Mom O'Shea. We've done 3 or 4 shows, and this is fundraising time there. If you want to send some money in, and tell her thank you for having Mae Brussell. And as soon as the month is over, and if they raise the funds, that's up to you and all the people who listen to the show to send in money if they like that kind of programming. I'll be back at KPFA, so I'll be doing monthly shows, and then back at KGO in San Francisco. Bob Trevor is in the Soviet Union right now on a vacation, but hopefully when he gets home we can get back there. If you call him and send him letters and call the station, they like to hear from you, then I'll be back with Bob again. But we will have these regular spots, and I hope the BAI can become a regular spot as it was before in New York City. So The rest is up to you. The stations like you to call. They like you to write to the station managers. They like you to call when we're on the air. And that's all it takes is for you to put that energy into it, and then these radio shows will keep rolling along. Well, back now to Michael Lebedev and Treason for My Daily Bread, the book that I am reviewing with you, and you have the address here. You can order them. There are several copies at Research at Box 1107 in Aptos, California, at 95003. Whoever writes first, Tom Davis, I think, has 2 or 3 copies that his brother brought over from England, and that's all. So if you're on the run and you want the book, write to him or write to the publisher in England. Well, Martin Bormann, back to their interesting escape. The fourth part of the book has to do with the escape of Michael Lebedev with Martin Bormann, and they're going down to Paraguay, and they have the assistance of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. That's a gentleman that worked with Adolf Hitler through the war, who organized the Muslims in the Middle East for Adolf Hitler, and I've given you the name of a book which I have, The Mufti and the Fuhrer, which is an interesting book on the background of the Grand Mufti. He sent an agent to Lebedev and Bormann, and this agent carried them through their trip. Interesting enough, they went with a group, the Haganah group. The Jewish refugees were sailing out of Italy over to Palestine, and they passed as 3 leaders of Jewish intelligence, and the Jews didn't know that on that ship was the notorious Martin Bormann, who probably with Adolf Hitler and Heydrich was behind these exterminations of the many, many millions, and the reason for their displacement and survival. In the first place, they didn't know that on that ship with them, going to Palestine, were 3 men, one a representative of the Grand Mufti, the other Lebedev, and also Martin Bormann. And then when they got into Palestine, the next story is their jump over to South America, where Martin Bormann is settled. Thanks to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, they're taken to Paraguay in South America, and that's where Martin Bormann goes. Now, he gives Lebedev an assignment, which is an iffy assignment, considering his background, that he suspected him originally of being a Russian agent, and he sends him into the Soviet Union to find out how many anti-communists are working there, part of the Galen operation after the war, to check out the anti-communist activity, how many supporters they have inside the Soviet Union. So Lebedev leaves South America, Paraguay, to go up to Russia, and when he gets into the Soviet Union, he loses his papers. He doesn't have the identity or the letters that he had when he was younger to prove who his father was. And he gets off the train to go to his hometown, to look over the hometown where he was born and raised. And he leaves the train station, and the Russian police pick him up and suspect him because he's broken off from the regular group, and they give him a very short hearing, which isn't even a trial. And they sent him to a concentration camp in Russia. They suspected him for spying on them, which is really, in fact, what he was sent to do by Bormann. But he didn't even have time to get to the KGB to tell of his experiences with Martin Bormann. He was sent to Bormann in the first place by the Soviets, and he never had a chance to get to them, and they wouldn't believe him. So they put him in this camp for 15 years, and he thought that he would be there for life and would never get out, and he tells the details of the Russian camp and the hardships. But after 15 years and all the paperwork and his allegations of his father and his background, and that he was actually sent by the Soviets to spy on Bormann in the first place, they came across his papers in the Russian bureaucratic scheme, and they released him, and they took him back and gave him clothing and shelter, and realized that he had been on their side, that he was a Russian that was sent to the Nazis in the first place, and they forgave him for not staying with the Russians at the time that the war was over, because he would have been killed by the Germans right then. He had no choice. But he was bounced around. The story gets a little complicated, and I'm trying to simplify it. It's logical if you follow what Michael Lebedev is saying. He was caught in both camps. He was in Germany when the war was over, and there was no way for him to stay behind and meet the Russians. The Germans were going to shoot him on the spot. And just as kidnappers use somebody in front of them as a foil, the person they've kidnapped would be shot first, his life was worth nothing if he didn't leave with Bormann, and he knew that he wouldn't get 5 miles out of town because he knew the money and the power behind the operation, the Nazis that were leaving, so he had to go with Bormann. And as soon as he set foot in Russia, they didn't believe him, and then they said, okay, prove it to us. If you didn't come to spy on us, prove it to us by going back to Bormann and telling us how strong is the Bormann Brotherhood, the Nazi spy operation that's operating today. So the Soviets sent him back into the arms of Bormann down in South America, and he was literally tossed from place to place. He was a person whose father had died 2 months before he was born. He had served both sides. He had been trained by a Russian system in the KGB for 5 years to infiltrate the Germans. When the war was over, they literally kidnapped him and took him as a barrier to protect them, and then sent him on a job which imprisoned him, and then his captors released him if he went down to South America. And then, of course, Bormann takes advantage of the man and tests his loyalty, because, again, he still has the machinery to kill him. So he tests him, and he says, okay, I'm going to give you an assignment. You can leave Paraguay, and I want you to go into New Orleans. And he gives the assignment to go to New Orleans, which eventually ends up at Dealey Plaza. And Michael Lebedev claims that Bormann knew all along that he was on a conveyor belt. There was no road out at any point of the turn, and as he says, he was always 50 feet from death if he made the wrong move. So after meeting with Bormann, he proceeds to New Orleans, and he's given a long list of names of persons of what he describes as Nazi ideology. He travels under the guise of being a Swiss engineer with a passport, Mikhail Lebedev, L-O-B-E-D-O, and said that he had European and Cuban blood. He doesn't go into the German background or the Russian background, but this time he's traveling as a Swiss. It's interesting, when he went down to Paraguay to find Bormann the second time when they went to locate him, he was under the name of Dr. Jung. And the new book on Dulles tells about the influence of Dr. Jung, the psychiatrist, upon Alan Dulles and his family, and it was sort of a turning point in Alan Dulles going into mind control for the CIA immediately after World War II, and during this whole period he was interested in mind control, and Dr. Jung was a name that Bormann was using down in South America. So Bormann sends him to New Orleans with his passport, and he's given an address, 107 Decatur Street, New Orleans, to see David Ferry. He goes there, and it's the wrong address. He goes to 117, and it's a bar. The people at the bar know him, and they tell him to go to Camp Street and ask for Guy Bannister at 544 Camp Street. And, of course, that's the address that Lee Harvey Oswald also used in New Orleans. And when he gets inside the building, he asks for Guy Bannister and mentions David Ferry's name, and the gentleman looks at him and says that he, in fact, was David Ferry in the office at that time. The way they were to meet was that he was to say, I am Mikhail Lebedev. I'm interested in assessing the strength of the anti-communist feelings in the southern states. Of course, Werner von Braun, the Nazi who should have been tried as a war criminal who escalated our space and satellite systems, was in Alabama, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, has been named in the Torbett document as part of the assassination team. And Dornberger's crony was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Michael Dornberger, and of course the whole rim, the southern rim, from California to Arizona, New Mexico, even Nevada and Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Miami, Louisiana, was filled with pro-Nazi, anti-communist sympathizers. David Ferry, he says, was a cover for the Central Intelligence Agency, and he spoke of his friend, a Colonel Orloff, who was interested in a survey of anti-communists, and it was Colonel Orloff who was with George de Mohrenschildt, as I mentioned, visited Marina Oswald the first time de Mohrenschildt met Marina. Orloff was with her. We don't know how many times, whether he saw her 2 times or 200 or just that once, but Orloff was with Marina Oswald and worked with David Ferry and George de Mohrenschildt. And then the colonel introduced himself as being part of a small white Russian community throughout the southern states, and a group called the White Russian Emigres in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that I identified years ago as belonging to Reinhard Gehlen's operation, Hitler's intelligence chief, Nazi, that worked with Allen Dulles. He goes into a home in Dallas to a party, and he meets various anti-Castro persons and anti-communists, and a Mr. Clay. He refers to him as Klee, but translated or explained later in the book he was referring to Clay Shaw. But Mr. Clay is the friend of Colonel Orloff and also David Ferry. And they talk about Ruth. He hints about this woman, Ruth, and I'm sure that they must mean Ruth Paine, who was close to Marina and de Mohrenschildt, and, as I say, her husband with Walter Dornberger. That's the home where Oswald was the night before the assassination, and left there and went to the Texas School Book Depository. And Ruth Paine was the woman who called Roy Truly and asked for a job for this person, and he was placed in that building where he could be a patsy, because the motorcade was decided much later. October 15th, Ruth Paine called Roy Truly, and October 16th, Lee went down there and began his employment in the Texas School Book Depository. They would later set him up as the decoy and the patsy. They talked about the Arab operations there and the anti-communist links, and of course the CIA foundations that were exposed in 1967 mentioned the Friends of the Middle East and the Arab connections of John Connolly and the various oil people that I listed off earlier on the other side of the tape. He refers to these Arab operations. And he met Guy Bannister, the gentleman who worked in Chicago with Robert Mayhew in the FBI, who set up the assassination teams in 1960. He then moved, Mayhew set him up with the CIA, and then Guy Bannister had worked with him in Chicago and had a detective agency in New Orleans where David Ferry worked, and Oswald shared the offices, and Lebedev noticed that there was no evidence of it being a detective agency. It was just a front for this other operation that later turned out to be Permindex and the assassination teams. He said David Ferry and Guy Bannister were taking orders from someone much higher up. And one day he was told, Lebedev was told by these men, we're going off to Dallas, but first you're going to Shreveport, Louisiana, to a motel that's run by one of us. We're going to pick up another man at the motel. Lebedev had been sent by Bormann to these people, and what they said was, we are going to Dallas. They went to Shreveport and met a man about 28 to 30 years old who is Zed, who he describes as the man who shot the .45, the fatal headshot to John Kennedy. And they got acquainted in this motel, which was a CIA safe house. And he tells how they got instructions for the assassination for their role, not anything doing with Lee Harvey Oswald in the building or a man in the Daltex building or on the roof of the building. This has nothing to do with other assassins. Michael Lebedev wrote this in 1966 from just his own experiences with these people, all that he knew, and then when I read you his conclusion, that's what he feels about the assassination, and this is the role he's had. He said that their instructions for the assassination were not printed and they weren't given on the telephone. They were on a tape recorder, and they opened up a package and they listened to the tape, and the tape said, listen carefully and make no notes and memorize every detail and know your assignment. And it said, it's your assignment, it's not a choice. And the tape goes on and says, we know the background of both of you. In the case of Zed, he was a child brought up in England who had a very strict father who used to beat him and whip him, and they had a fight, and Zed had killed his father and left England. And of course, Lebedev had this role of working for Martin Bormann and also having been in the prison camps in Russia, tossed back and forth by the two systems and trained as a spy against the Nazis and then sent back by Bormann to spy against the Russians. So they had the background of both men, and the tape supplied the background and said, in quotes, we can ensure your death. You're not free to travel 50 feet from here. You will be supplied with 1 round of ammunition. And Lebedev wrote that the Bormann assignment to go see David Ferry was a ploy to get him here in the Shreveport Hotel to meet Zed, and that Zed led him to Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. In the hotel room at Shreveport, they were given a replica of Dealey Plaza, a little figurines, I guess, made up showing the trees, the fence, where they were to stand. It was a model, and it was for target referral with all kinds of instructions. And then Zed was to wear a headpiece. Now, Lebedev wasn't to do anything but to escort him there, sort of to watch over him and make sure he did his job, to wear a headpiece and take their firing position, and it was marked I guess, gauged off from where John Kennedy's car would make that detour down the street in the visible stop where they could get a crossfire at that particular moment. And the firing position was marked by an automobile which was parked at the spot in back. And they were to go find this car and see this car, and have a headpiece that was to be delivered 1 hour before the zero. 1 hour before Kennedy was to be killed, a headpiece would be brought to them by some men, and the salary was $20,000 for one of the men and $30,000 after the successful conclusion, after John Kennedy got that headshot from over by the fence. Lebedev said there was no way out of it. They were totally trapped, and he'd been in similar situations like this, it seems, all of his life since being trained in the Soviet Union and sent to Germany in the higher echelons of the German government. And he had to go through with the appointed task because there is no way of running away. They find you at borders or airplanes or car rentals. There's no way to hide and nowhere to go and nowhere to run. He implies that the Bormann Brotherhood catches up with you, and when you fail or you know too much, you're gunned down. And certainly the list of about 130 witnesses now to the John Kennedy assassination, such as Robert Mayhew's his hired underlings like John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, and even high-up men like Carlos Prios-Siqueiros and Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister and so forth are dead. So what Lebedev is saying is true, and he knew that. And he said he couldn't carry away with him any evidence, no notes, no directions. Nothing was done. They had to memorize it from the tape and learn it. And he talked with Zed in the motel room and got his background, as I say, having killed his father. And Zed said that he had no fear of the consequences. He had no pangs of conscience, and that it was just a job to be done. He saw a target in the crosshair. He squeezed the trigger, and his motive was simply that whenever he killed some man, he was killing his father, and he'd had a miserable life, and it was a way of making a buck, and that's the way he did it. He earned his money, and he was well trained, and the book doesn't go into where Zed departed with Lebedev. They split up after the job was done, and it doesn't tell if Zed went back and collected his $20,000 that was promised him, or whether he was murdered, or maybe he went on to other places to do other assassinations. That isn't clear, and he doesn't try to pretend to know where Zed is. He just knows that he worked with him, and they were committed. And he said, I stood committed to an act for which I had neither the motive or the stomach, but I was committed just the same. And the commitment that they use is just simply survival. And if it isn't him, as he said, it would be somebody else, so he went with it. And they went to the fence at Dealey Plaza, where they were instructed, and Zed got out an automatic revolver. He says it was a .45, that Zed doesn't like to use a rifle, never has used a rifle. He uses a .45, and he said to him very clearly, I shan't miss, not at this range. I'm not a rifleman. I never have been, but this is going to be easy. A station wagon moves into the parking area in front of the railroad track, and they felt the wagon was surveying them. There was some controversy about a station wagon picking up Lee Harvey Oswald in front of the Texas School Book Depository after the assassination, but we don't know if it's the same station wagon or not. That wagon belonged to Ruth Payne, because he has no detail about the station wagon. Maybe he didn't realize how important it was at the time. The color of it or the model didn't seem to catch his fancy. It was just the fact that he felt they were under surveillance all the time, and that the station wagon would pull up. And Zed said, one way or another, it's the end of the road for me. He felt it was, and he felt that he should. He said, I reckon I'd have been smart to stop up there in the Windy City instead of coming south. But it sounded like a good idea, and by the time I found out of what sort of a deal it was too late. It's too late for wishing. There's no going back to meaning Chicago. Now, as I say, this is where the assassination plan was to take place. It was November the 1st, 1963, and it was called off. And it's hard because there are no documents here to evaluate what Lebedev is saying. But it seems that this Zed was going to be one of the gunmen, and we know that a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, not the same one in the Dallas-Fort Worth area who had a car, was involved in the Chicago plot. As a matter of fact, Sherman Skolnick sent out some literature about this that I might go into next week on the tape with you on the Chicago plot. And so the shooting took place, the car went down the street and Dealey Plaza, and he pulled that 45, and he could hear other shots at the same time, just about the same time, and hit it right on target, and the two men split. And Lebedev didn't collect his money. He went to a car agency. He had some money on him, and he bought a tractor, a truck, and he got some blue jeans and disguised himself and traveled south and got out of the country and went to Beirut, where he was living from 1963 until 1966, when he had completed this manuscript and put it in the hands of this book publisher, who then decided to get it out in 1976, 77, and I first heard about it in 1978. It's hard to evaluate all this material. It's hard to digest it and say, is Michael Lebedev telling you the truth? There was a Buddy Walters, a Dallas policeman, who picked up a .45 caliber slug over there at the grassy knoll where Zed was supposed to be located. He turned it to the Dallas Police Department. It was never used by the Warren Commission. Lebedev says that he and Zed were picked up as suspects and taken off by the Dallas police because they were on the scene. They pretended they were going after the alleged assassin and acted like they were running in the direction of the police looking for them, but they were picked up as suspects, and they were taken into the police department, and then they said, oh, we have the assassin, it's Lee Harvey Oswald, and the suspects were released and their names weren't taken, so that he was allowed to leave town. He had that kind of cooperation, and he implied that that's how high up the conspiracy is, that he had that kind of cooperation. And I've listed for you on the sheet here some information that would confirm what Lebedev is saying, but which I think would be difficult for him to have had in 1966 when he wrote this. If he wrote this book in 1979, it would be different because of, say, so many radio tapes I have out and so many books that are out and published manuscripts. But there's certain characters here that line up to what he was saying in 1966, that even though he was working on a need-to-know basis, could confirm some of the things. And he was saying, he talks about J. Edgar Hoover and his complicity as the man who thought he was doing the right thing and knew differently. And there are links of J. Edgar Hoover to Meyer Heydrich and Martin Bormann and Interpol and the Nazi connections. He doesn't mention Albert Osborne, but Osborne had a school for assassins, and Zed, who he meets in Shreveport, comes from nowhere but is a very well-trained assassin, knows what he's doing, he's cool. They simply meet at a hotel, and they're given their lesson, and Zed goes off very cold-blooded and not embarrassed and knows it's a salary, and it could be that Zed came from the same kind of a missionary as these trained assassins that Albert Osborne ran, because Osborne worked with Clay Shaw and David Ferry in Permindex. His home base was Tennessee and Alice, Texas. But Zed could have come from that establishment, and being as the Warren Commission and G. Robert Blakey's group didn't look into Albert Osborne connections, we're 15 more years away if ever they get into that. We know the Vatican did write papers for Martin Bormann, and that he was housed, disguised as a monk, and then housed as a missionary and secluded in a garden reading books and so forth, and went over the Brenner Pass and stayed there and left with papers and documents to go to South America. Ladislav Farago wrote his book Aftermath, The Search for Martin Bormann, in 1974, where he describes the route that was taken out of Italy, that the Vatican helped him leave from Germany and out of Italy. So there's no way that Michael Lebedev could have had this information in 1966. There were also Nazi connections of Jean de Mohrenschildt and George de Mohrenschildt and the Bormann Brotherhood to Lee Harvey Oswald and Ruth Paine, as I said before, her husband working for Walter Dornberger, and Clay Shaw. Clay, he talks about working with Reinhard Gehlen and Gehlen's agents. The story of Permindex and the Tormod document didn't come out till 1972. This book was published in 1977, or began to be printed in 1977, and whether it was updated or not by persons other than Michael Lebedev and changed from the 1966 manuscript, we'll never know. Did they take a story that he wrote and then put in these stories based upon other books? That's the unknown question. It came out a long time after it was given to this particular publisher, but I can see why his message was very strong in 1966, and certainly by 1977, the story of America and the assassinations and the questions about the assassinations that were being raised would make it more interesting to publish at that late date. But there's no way of knowing if the manuscript was updated with the new information that came out, or whether Lebedev had that early information a long time ago. There's no way of knowing what's in his head or to follow that through, and that is an unknown question. And I know that there are these Nazi connections. I know that Buddy Walters did pick up a .45 slug. There are too many interesting parallels or facts that overlay this that he had no way of knowing. And it's an interesting story. Treason for My Daily Bread. If you can get it, I don't know if it's in the library. You might ask them to get it. You can order it or buy it. But because there are so many links to the Nazis, I thought I should spend one whole tape sharing this with you. Next week, we'll get back to an update of the news. There's so many things happening. I just wish we had an hour a week. I say that every week, but we don't have. But we'll update the news, and if you want to get this book, you can. But this, in essence, is what it's about, and I think I've taken the major parts out for you, and I hope it's understandable. It's hard in a one-hour tape to tell you all the intricacies of his life. That was a complicated life, or his motivation for being in the places that he was, but it is all logical and can be explained and seems to make sense, and in the end you feel very sorry for Lebedev, and yet you appreciate that if he's telling the truth, it's so that we can have a better country, and he seems to be pleading for that. And he's pleading for all of you out there to make changes and don't worship these people that are doing these things, but take them off their pedestal, kick out from under them the glory that they get for doing these things, and expose them for the murderers that they are. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be with you next week. Take care and have a good week.